What is up, guys? Today I'm working on my 80 series Land Cruiser and I'm replacing my front brakes, rotors, and pads. Recently my brake pads have been making a noise when I brake and they definitely need replacing. So I'm going to show you everything you need for this repair along with some tips and tricks that I learned along the way. Hopefully this video can save you some time and some money and gets your 80 series back on the road. These are the tools that you're going to need. I'll list them in the description below along with links to where to purchase them. Throughout the video, you'll notice I'll be referencing this diagram, which includes everything that the factory service manual has regarding the front axle on the 80 series Land Cruiser. It was super handy for this repair. For those of you that have been around the 80 series community long enough, you'll remember that there used to be a site where we can purchase one very similar to this and a bunch of other really awesome Land Cruiser parts. Unfortunately, they're no longer in business, so I decided to make my own. Now let's get started with the repair. With the car on jack stands and the tire removed, turn the steering wheel to access the caliper. Open the brake reservoir and cover it so no dust or debris gets on it. You'll want to be careful not to damage the brake line while working in here. Using a 17mm socket, remove the two bolts that attach the brake caliper. I had to use a breaker bar for this.
Okay, now that it's loosened up, we can get in here. So that'll come out with a washer. Comes right off.
Tie off the caliper to the side and don't let the brake line hang to prevent damage. Remove the dust cap with a flathead screwdriver and a hammer by slowly prying it out. To remove the snap ring, I used a hook and a flathead screwdriver to pry it out and a set of pliers to remove it. If you have snap ring pliers, use those. With a 12mm socket, remove the 6 flange nuts and washers from the hub flange. Hammer out the cone nuts till they pop out and remove the flange. Remove the flange gasket.
There should be a gasket right here.
This one is actually stuck on here and you'll want to replace this. Clean out the grease so you can get a good view of the lock nut. Unbend the lock washer tab using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. Remove the lock nut with a 54mm socket, or if you're in a pinch like me, use a flathead and a hammer. Toyota recommends using the 54mm socket as you're going to need to torque this down later. Remove the lock washer. Remove the adjusting nut with a 54mm socket. I'm using a flathead and a hammer. Remove the thrust washer. This should come off pretty easily. The outer bearing will come out, so set it aside. We're going to clean it up and re-grease it. While I'm in here, I like to keep things clean, so I'm going to remove the grease from the knuckle spindle. With the rotor and the hub sub assembly removed, we're going to spray some PB Blaster or WD-40 on the 17mm bolts to separate the rotor from the hub sub assembly. I had to use an impact wrench because I don't have anything to clamp the rotor down to keep it from moving. Use a screwdriver and a hammer to separate the rotor from the hub sub assembly. Check the old bearings to make sure they're in good shape. Remove old grease from the hub and clean it so we can add some new high temp bearing grease. Now it's time for reassembly. I'm going to lay some cleaning shop towels down to avoid getting grease on the new rotors. Add some Loctite to the 17mm hub bolts and tighten them back up using a crisscross pattern. And we're going to tighten these to 47 foot-pounds using a torque wrench. Using some high temp bearing grease, we're going to pack the hub with grease just like it was before. The goal here is to coat the inside of the hub along with the oil seal and bearings. Before I install this, I'm going to clean the rotor with brake cleaner to remove any excess grease. I'm going to add some high temp grease around the area where the outer bearing will sit. I'm going to be rebuilding my entire front axle soon, so I won't be replacing any bearings just yet. But if you're not planning on rebuilding yours, this might be a good time to replace some bearings if they look a little worn. I'm going to clean up these bearings and pack them up with grease. To pack these with grease, you'll just want to make sure they're coated with grease and that the grease comes out of the other side to ensure they are fully coated. Place the outer bearing. Now the thrust washer. The adjusting nut, you'll notice I'm using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. However, Toyota recommends torquing it down to 43 foot-pounds, moving the hub back and forth to ensure the bearing seats properly, then loosening it up again, and then tightening it up again to 4 foot-pounds. Second Gear Low has a great video on this, so check him out. Here's how he did it. Okay, now the lock washer. Now the lock nut using a 54 millimeter, and we're going to torque this down to 47 foot-pounds. You'll notice I'm using a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. However, Toyota recommends using a 54 millimeter socket and using a torque wrench to torque it down to 47 foot-pounds. We're going to fold the tabs on the lock washer to keep the lock nut in place. Add some high temp bearing grease again.
On this one, remember there is a gasket here, so you'll want to clean this off completely before you put it back on. I'm going to just reuse my gasket because I'm going to tear it apart again when I rebuild my front axle in a couple weeks. But otherwise, you get that gasket and put it on.
Now we place the hub flange. To tighten it back up, we're going to use the cone washer, the washer, and the flange nut, and we're going to torque this down to 26 foot-pounds. With some snap ring pliers, put the snap ring back on. This might be quite challenging because the axle shaft will want to keep moving back and forth, so I'm using a spare bolt to keep it from moving. This process was a bit tedious as the snap ring was not wanting to cooperate. I ended up hammering the brass ends on the snap ring pliers to create a small ledge, which allowed me to open the snap ring and slip it over the axle shaft without it flying across the garage. Now it's time to move on to the brake pads. These are in awful condition and we'll need to replace these. Start by removing the retaining clip on the side of the brake caliper. Now remove the 2 pins from the caliper. I'm using a long pin punch and a hammer since they're stuck on here pretty good. Now we're going to remove the anti-rattle spring, the pads, and the anti-squeal shims which were stuck on there.
Let's just look at how bad these brakes were. Wow. Jeez. Completely gone.
We're going to push the pistons on the caliper back to make room for the new pads. I use this brake separator tool, which wasn't really that effective, so I wouldn't really recommend this. You can use something like the wood end of a hammer. The goal is to not damage the pistons. While I was working on the other side, I realized my pistons were completely seized, and just to demonstrate how bad these are, I tried to use pliers to push them back and they wouldn't budge. You can also tell that the piston seals are completely shot and that I need new calipers. I'll post a video on how to do that soon. And just to show you how bad it was, look at these brake pads.
Wow, that is not good at all.
You can even see pieces of metal that were grinding down, and look at how bad the rotor is. Completely grinded down from that side. The previous owner definitely neglected this 80 series, and so did the current owner apparently. Alright, enough of that. Let's put the pads back on. So what you'll want to do is make sure that the pads are aligned so that the pinholes are facing the side where the pins are going to go through. So just go ahead and run the pins through there, through the pinholes, and we'll attach the anti-rattle spring and the clip. And now we're going to install the caliper back. We're going to put some thread locker on the 17mm caliper bolts, and we're going to tighten those down to 90 foot-pounds. And finally, we're going to hammer the dust cap back on. And now we're going to do the same exact steps on the other side, but in super fast mode. If you want to watch, here's 2 minutes of me doing it super fast. But that was it for the video today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it helps you in your journey to restoring your Land Cruiser back to its original shape. And if you guys are interested in one of these 80 series Land Cruiser front axle reference diagrams, please let me know in the comments below. You guys have a good one.
Get